Long before the streets of Pompeii became an archaeological site, they were simply streets. People walked along them carrying baskets, clay vessels, tools, and food. Merchants opened their shops in the morning. Bakers prepared bread. Children moved between houses. Donkeys carried goods. Water flowed through public fountains, and voices filled the narrow lanes. Pompeii was not built as a monument to the future. It was an ordinary Roman town, shaped by generations of people who lived, worked, argued, traded, worshipped, celebrated, and eventually died there. Its remarkable story begins with that ordinary life, because the city we see today is valuable precisely because so much of that everyday world was preserved. Pompeii stood in the fertile region of Campania, south of Rome, close to the Bay of Naples. Mount Vesuvius rose nearby, although the people who lived around it did not yet understand that the mountain concealed an active volcano. The surrounding countryside was productive, with vineyards, orchards, farmland, and access to important coastal routes. The climate was generally mild, and the area attracted wealthy Romans as well as merchants, farmers, craftsmen, and laborers. Pompeii was connected to a much larger Mediterranean world. Ships moved through nearby ports, roads connected the town with other settlements, and goods arrived from distant parts of the Roman Empire. The city itself had a long history before Rome controlled it. Archaeological evidence shows that the area was inhabited centuries before the eruption of Vesuvius. Different peoples influenced the settlement, including communities associated with the Oscan-speaking population, the Greeks, and the Samnites. Eventually, Pompeii came under Roman control, and its architecture and institutions became increasingly Roman. By the 1st century CE, Latin was widely used. Roman political structures dominated public life, and the city had become part of the expanding Roman world. Yet traces of earlier traditions remained beneath the Roman surface. Pompeii was therefore not a city created overnight, but a layered place whose streets carried memories from several centuries. Walking through Pompeii today can feel strangely intimate because the city contains so many small details. There are thresholds worn by footsteps, grooves cut into roads by carts, stone benches, fountains, ovens, painted walls, drainage channels, and shop counters. These details are not spectacular in isolation. A doorway is simply a doorway. A millstone is simply a millstone. A cooking vessel is simply a cooking vessel. Yet together they allow archaeologists to reconstruct ordinary routines. The city becomes less like a collection of ruins, and more like a neighborhood whose residents have only recently departed. At the center of Roman Pompeii was the Forum, an open public space surrounded by important buildings. Here people conducted business, encountered officials, participated in religious activities, and gathered for civic events. Temples stood nearby, along with administrative and commercial structures. The Forum was not merely a marketplace. It was one of the places where the city expressed its political and religious identity. Statues and inscriptions reminded residents of emperors, magistrates, benefactors, and gods. Public buildings showed the resources and ambitions of the community. In the Roman world, architecture was often a language of status, and Pompeii spoke that language in stone. Beyond the Forum, the city became more residential and commercial. Streets varied in width and importance. Some were carefully paved with large blocks of volcanic stone. At many intersections, raised stepping stones allowed pedestrians to cross without walking directly through muddy water or waste flowing along the roadway. Cartwheels left grooves in the paving. These marks are among the simplest surviving records of movement. A wheel passing over stone again and again can leave a trace that survives longer than the person who drove the cart. Pompeii contains thousands of such quiet traces. Water was another essential part of city life. Pompeii was supplied through an aqueduct connected to the broader Roman water system, and water was distributed through public fountains and private properties. Not every resident enjoyed the same access, and the system changed over time, but the presence of running water demonstrates the sophistication of Roman urban infrastructure. Lead pipes carried water to different locations, while fountains provided public access. Behind this apparently simple convenience stood engineers, maintenance workers, administrators, and a network of channels that had to function continuously. The houses of Pompeii reveal equally interesting differences in wealth. Some were modest dwellings with practical rooms arranged around small courtyards. Others were enormous residences belonging to wealthy families. The most famous houses contain painted walls, mosaic floors, gardens, fountains, columns, dining rooms, and private shrines. Yet even the largest homes were not simply private spaces. Roman households were social institutions. A wealthy man might receive clients in the morning, conduct business from his home, display family connections, and host meals in carefully arranged rooms. Architecture helped communicate who a person was and where he belonged within society. One of the most beautiful features of Pompeian houses was the garden. Some gardens were surprisingly sophisticated, with painted walls designed to create the impression of landscapes, carefully arranged plants, fountains, sculptures, and shaded spaces. In a Mediterranean climate, a garden could provide relief from the heat and a place for conversation. It could also display wealth. Plants that were difficult to obtain or maintain could become symbols of status. Archaeologists have studied preserved seeds, pollen, roots, and carbonized plant remains to reconstruct aspects of these gardens. Even the remains of plants can tell stories about ancient taste and daily life. Food was central to Pompeian life. Bread was baked in large quantities, and several bakeries have been identified throughout the city. Large millstones were used to grind grain, often turned by animals. Ovens were built into bakery complexes, and carbonized loaves have survived from the eruption. These loaves are particularly remarkable because they preserve the outline of ordinary food prepared on an ordinary day. Somewhere in Pompeii, before the disaster, someone mixed flour and water, shaped the dough, placed it into an oven, and expected the bread to be eaten. Instead, the eruption transformed it into an archaeological record. Restaurants and food shops were also common. Archaeologists have identified numerous establishments with counters containing large ceramic vessels set into them. These were likely places where prepared food and drink could be purchased. Such businesses remind us that ancient cities had forms of convenience similar in principle to those of later urban societies. Not everyone cooked every meal at home. People purchased food, met others, conducted business, and spent time in public establishments. The surviving counters are therefore not just architectural curiosities. They are evidence of an urban economy built around the daily needs of thousands of people. Pompeii also had laundries, workshops, warehouses, and small manufacturing businesses. Cloth could be processed using water and chemicals, pottery could be produced and sold, metalworkers could repair objects, and craftsmen could create furniture, tools, jewelry, and decorative goods. The city was economically diverse. Some people worked from substantial commercial buildings, while others operated smaller businesses connected directly to their homes. The boundaries between residence and workplace were often much less rigid than they are in modern cities. A doorway might lead to a shop in front and living quarters behind it. Roman society was highly unequal, and Pompeii reflected those inequalities. Wealth determined the size of houses, access to luxury goods, social influence, and political power. Enslaved people formed an important part of the economy and household structure. Freed people could accumulate wealth and participate in commerce, while freeborn citizens possessed different legal and social privileges. Women could own property in certain circumstances and participate in economic life, although Roman society remained strongly patriarchal. The graffiti and inscriptions of Pompeii occasionally provide glimpses of these different groups, reminding us that the city was populated not by one uniform community, but by people whose lives and opportunities varied considerably. The walls of Pompeii are especially valuable because people wrote on them. Some inscriptions were formal and commemorative, while others were advertisements, political messages, jokes, personal remarks, or simple records of names. Election notices encouraged residents to support particular candidates for local office. Advertisements promoted gladiatorial games. Individuals wrote messages that were never intended to become historical documents. This informal writing gives Pompeii a distinctive human voice. The Roman world was not silent. People wrote about politics, love, money, entertainment, arguments, and ordinary concerns, just as people have done in many societies since. Religion was woven through the city. Temples were dedicated to different gods, and household shrines allowed families to maintain religious practices within their homes. Small images and painted scenes represented gods, mythological stories, and protective spirits. The Romans did not separate religion from daily life in the modern sense. Rituals could accompany meals, business, public ceremonies, journeys, marriages, and political events. At Pompeii, religious architecture ranged from large public temples to small domestic shrines. The city, therefore, contained many different sacred spaces, each serving a different social purpose. Among the most important religious institutions was the cult of Isis, an Egyptian goddess whose worship had spread throughout the Mediterranean. Pompeii contained a temple dedicated to Isis, reconstructed after an earlier earthquake. Its presence demonstrates how connected the ancient Mediterranean world had become. Religious ideas could travel across regions just as goods and people did. A goddess whose origins lay in Egypt could become part of the religious landscape of an Italian town. Pompeii was therefore local and cosmopolitan at the same time. Entertainment occupied another important place in Roman society. Pompeii possessed an amphitheater capable of holding thousands of spectators. Here gladiatorial contests and other public spectacles were staged. The building was not merely a place for violence. It was also a social institution where different groups gathered, political identities were reinforced, and wealthy sponsors could display generosity. Spectacles were expensive, and sponsoring them could increase prestige. The amphitheater therefore connected entertainment with politics, economics, and social status. The city's theaters offered another form of entertainment. Pompeii had both a large theater and a smaller covered theater known as the Odeon. Performances could include drama, music, and other forms of public entertainment. The architecture reveals how carefully Roman communities designed spaces for spectatorship. Seats were arranged according to social status, with different sections reflecting the hierarchy of the audience. Even leisure was organized according to the structure of society. Not far from these public spaces were the baths. Roman bathing was much more than washing. Public baths were places to exercise, socialize, relax, conduct conversations, and participate in urban life. The buildings contained rooms with different temperatures, and sophisticated heating systems circulated hot air beneath floors and through walls. A bath complex required engineering, fuel, water, maintenance, and staff. The presence of such facilities in Pompeii shows that urban comfort was an important part of Roman culture, at least for those who could access it. Life in Pompeii was not always peaceful. The city experienced earthquakes, and the most significant known earthquake before the eruption occurred in 62 CE. Buildings were damaged, temples required repair, and reconstruction continued for years afterward. Some areas of the city were still being repaired when Vesuvius erupted. This detail is important because Pompeii was not a perfectly preserved city frozen at a moment of prosperity. It was a living place undergoing change. Walls were being repainted, buildings were being repaired, businesses were adapting, some structures were incomplete. The city was in the middle of ordinary life when extraordinary events arrived. Mount Vesuvius itself was part of the landscape. The volcano rises beside the Bay of Naples and dominates the surrounding region. Today we know that it is an active volcano and that its geological history includes numerous eruptions. The ancient inhabitants did not possess modern volcanology. They had no instruments for measuring seismic activity deep beneath the mountain and no scientific framework for understanding volcanic systems. Earthquakes were familiar, but the connection between earthquakes, magma, and explosive eruptions was not understood as it is today. The 1st century was also a time of major political change across the Roman world. Pompeii had become a Roman colony, and its residents participated in local political institutions. The emperor stood at the center of the wider imperial system, but local officials continued to manage municipal affairs. Elections, public offices, religious positions, and civic benefactions remained important. Pompeii's inscriptions preserve names of candidates and supporters, allowing us to see that local politics could be active and competitive. The city was therefore not simply controlled from distant Rome. It had its own civic life. As the year 79 CE approached, Pompeii continued its routines. Markets opened, bread was prepared, builders repaired walls, merchants moved goods, families ate meals, public baths operated. The amphitheater remained part of the city's cultural landscape. There was no clear sign that an event was approaching that would preserve these activities for nearly 2,000 years. That is one of the strange qualities of Pompeii. The city was not abandoned intentionally. Its people did not prepare a museum. They simply continued living. The exact date of the eruption has been debated because ancient manuscripts give slightly different readings, although modern scholarship generally places it in late October of 79 CE rather than the traditional August date. What is certain is that Vesuvius erupted catastrophically during the reign of the Emperor Titus. The eruption began with a massive column of ash and volcanic material rising into the atmosphere. Ash fell across the surrounding region, while pumice accumulated on rooftops, streets, courtyards, and open ground. The eruption did not immediately destroy everything. At first, people had time to understand that something serious was happening. Pumice fell for hours, gradually accumulating to significant depths. Roofs could collapse under the weight. Buildings became difficult to navigate. The atmosphere darkened. Some residents left the city. Others remained, perhaps believing the danger would pass or perhaps unable to leave. The experience would have been confusing. Without modern forecasts, evacuation plans, or scientific warnings, people had to make decisions based on what they could see and hear. The Roman author Pliny the Younger witnessed the eruption from across the Bay of Naples and later described aspects of it in letters. His uncle, Pliny the Elder, commanded the Roman fleet at Misenum and died during the disaster. Pliny the Younger's accounts are among the most important written sources for the eruption. They describe the enormous volcanic cloud, the darkness, the falling material, and the movements of people attempting to escape. His descriptions later contributed to the term Plinian eruption, used by volcanologists for eruptions involving tall, sustained columns of volcanic material. Meanwhile, Pompeii was being buried under falling pumice and ash. The material accumulated over streets and roofs, gradually changing the physical structure of the city. Buildings collapsed. Doors became blocked. People who remained inside were trapped or forced to find other routes. The city was becoming increasingly difficult to inhabit, yet the most destructive phase was still to come. Eventually, pyroclastic currents and surges moved rapidly down the slopes of Vesuvius. These hot mixtures of gas, ash, and volcanic fragments could travel quickly and were lethal. People caught in these currents had little chance of survival. The heat was extreme, and the speed of the flows made escape difficult or impossible. Some victims died in buildings. Others were found in streets, courtyards, or open spaces. The precise circumstances varied from person to person. Archaeologists have identified evidence of people attempting to escape, while others appear to have sheltered indoors. The human remains recovered at Pompeii are therefore not a single story of one final moment. They represent thousands of individual decisions made during a rapidly changing disaster. The eruption eventually covered Pompeii beneath meters of volcanic material. Herculaneum, another nearby town, experienced a somewhat different fate. There, extremely hot pyroclastic material rapidly buried buildings and preserved organic materials, such as wood, in remarkable detail. Pompeii's preservation was different, but together the two sites provide an extraordinary record of the eruption. The disaster that destroyed the communities also created the conditions that protected many objects from later disturbance. After the eruption, the Roman world moved on. The landscape around Vesuvius changed. Survivors rebuilt their lives elsewhere. Some valuable objects were removed from the buried towns by people searching through the deposits. Over time, knowledge of the exact location and character of Pompeii faded. The city was not completely forgotten, but it ceased to exist as a living settlement. Vegetation grew across parts of the area. The buried streets disappeared beneath the ground. For centuries, Pompeii existed largely as a hidden layer beneath the landscape. The rediscovery of Pompeii happened gradually. Excavations in the region began centuries later, and systematic work expanded during the 18th century. Early excavators were often interested in valuable objects, statues, inscriptions, and artworks rather than in preserving the complete context of the site. Archaeological methods changed over time. Researchers increasingly recognized that the arrangement of objects, buildings, layers, and human remains was itself evidence. Pompeii slowly became not just a place where ancient treasures could be found, but a historical record that needed to be studied as a whole. One of the most haunting discoveries came from the plaster casts of human victims. When bodies decomposed inside the hardened volcanic material, they sometimes left cavities. Archaeologists could pour plaster into these cavities, producing forms that captured the position of the victims at the moment of death. These casts are powerful, but they must be understood carefully. They are not photographs of the dead. They are impressions created by a specific archaeological technique. Modern researchers continue to use new methods, including CT scanning and DNA analysis, to study the remains while reducing unnecessary damage. The city itself also preserves objects that seem almost too ordinary to matter. A wooden door, a ceramic bowl, a child's toy, a cooking pot, a bronze vessel, a small piece of jewelry, a fragment of painted plaster. These objects allow archaeologists to reconstruct patterns of life. History is often written around kings, battles, and political events, but Pompeii offers something different. It allows us to study the material environment of people who left behind relatively little written history. Their homes and possessions become documents. The graffiti provides another layer of ordinary voices. Some messages were written in charcoal and could disappear naturally under ordinary circumstances, but the eruption preserved them. People wrote names, jokes, advertisements, insults, declarations of affection, and political endorsements. Some were probably temporary and never intended to survive. Their accidental preservation gives historians access to informal communication. In a sense, the eruption froze not only buildings, but fragments of conversation. One of the most interesting aspects of Pompeii is the evidence of social mobility. Some freedmen and their descendants became wealthy and influential. Their houses could be decorated with expensive materials, and inscriptions reveal participation in local public life. This complicates the simple image of Roman society as a fixed hierarchy. Status mattered deeply, but wealth and patronage could change an individual's position. Pompeii's buildings reveal these differences in subtle ways. A large house might belong to someone whose family history was very different from that of the traditional Roman aristocracy. The city's paintings also reveal much about Roman taste. Walls could be decorated with scenes from mythology, architecture, gardens, landscapes, theatrical imagery, and still life arrangements. The paintings were not always intended to look realistic in the modern sense. They played with perspective, illusion, color, and architectural framing. A small room could appear to open into an imaginary garden or distant landscape. Art transformed interior space. The result was a world in which architecture and painting worked together to create an atmosphere of abundance. Mosaics served a similar purpose. Small pieces of colored stone or glass could be arranged into geometric patterns, animals, mythological scenes, and elaborate decorative borders. Some mosaics were relatively simple, while others were highly detailed. Floors were practical surfaces, but they also communicated identity and taste. The famous mosaic depicting Alexander the Great's battle with the Persian king Darius is one example of the extraordinary artistic culture preserved in the region. Although it was found in the nearby House of the Faun, rather than being a typical decoration for every household. The House of the Faun itself illustrates the scale of wealth possible in Pompeii. Its enormous footprint, gardens, mosaics, and architectural arrangement indicate an exceptionally prosperous household. Yet such houses were not representative of everyone. Most residents lived in smaller and simpler spaces. The contrast between elaborate villas and modest dwellings is one reason Pompeii is so useful for social history. A city can contain many different worlds within the same walls. The streets also reveal economic activity. Shops opened directly onto roads. Some had large counters, others workshops or storage rooms. Businesses depended on foot traffic and neighborhood relationships. A resident could walk only a short distance and encounter food sellers, craftsmen, laundries, wine shops, bakeries, and other services. Pompeii therefore had a dense urban economy. The city was compact, and public and private life overlapped constantly. One can imagine an ordinary morning before the eruption. The sun rises over the Bay of Naples. Workers begin moving through the streets. Bakers prepare ovens. Shopkeepers lift shutters. Water flows from fountains. A mule carries goods toward a market. A politician's supporter adds another painted message to a wall. Somewhere, a family prepares breakfast. In another house, a wealthy resident receives visitors. Children walk toward lessons. Priests perform rituals. Nothing about the morning announces that it will become one of the best preserved moments of Roman daily life. This is perhaps the central reason Pompeii remains so compelling. Ancient history often gives us monuments but not ordinary moments. We know that emperors ruled, armies marched, and temples were built, but we rarely know what the street looked like on an ordinary afternoon. Pompeii comes unusually close. The city preserves the arrangement of homes, shops, kitchens, roads, fountains, and public buildings together. Instead of reconstructing an ancient town entirely from scattered evidence, archaeologists can walk through its streets and observe how the pieces fit together. Yet preservation is never perfect. Pompeii was damaged by the eruption, by earthquakes before it, by later looting, by weather, by excavation methods, and by modern neglect. Some buildings have deteriorated after being exposed to the atmosphere. Painted walls fade. Rain enters structures. Vegetation can damage masonry. Archaeological conservation is therefore an ongoing task. The challenge is not simply to uncover the city, but to protect what has already been uncovered. Modern technology has changed the way researchers study Pompeii. Three-dimensional scanning can document buildings. Ground-penetrating methods can reveal structures without immediate excavation. Digital models allow researchers to study architectural relationships. CT scans can examine human remains and objects internally. Chemical analysis can identify pigments, food residues, and materials. DNA studies can sometimes reveal aspects of ancestry and biological relationships. These methods allow archaeologists to ask questions that earlier excavators could not easily investigate. The volcanic ash also preserved evidence of climate and environment. Plant remains, seeds, pollen, and animal bones provide information about agriculture and diet. Researchers can reconstruct parts of the surrounding ecosystem and understand what foods were available. Fish bones and shell remains reveal connections with the sea. Carbonized grains show what was stored or processed. Even tiny fragments can contribute to a broader picture of the local economy. Pompeii's connection to the sea was important even though the shoreline has changed over time. The city was associated with maritime trade, and nearby ports connected it to wider Mediterranean networks. Wine, olive oil, grain, pottery, luxury goods, and other materials moved through these systems. Amphorae found at Pompeii can sometimes reveal the origins of products. A container is therefore more than a container. Its shape, markings, residue, and clay composition can help reconstruct ancient trade routes. Wine was particularly important in Campania. The volcanic soils around Vesuvius supported vineyards, and wine production formed part of the regional economy. Ancient agricultural estates could produce wine for local consumption and wider markets. Some villas combined residential, agricultural, and commercial functions. The landscape around Pompeii was therefore not simply beautiful countryside. It was an economic system in which land, labor, crops, transport, and trade were closely connected. The volcano itself also shaped the fertility of the region. Volcanic soils can become highly productive, even though eruptions bring catastrophic destruction. This paradox is important. The same geological forces that created fertile agricultural land could also destroy communities. People living around Vesuvius benefited from the landscape without understanding the full geological process beneath it. Their relationship with the mountain was therefore both practical and unknowingly dangerous. Roman attitudes toward natural disasters were complex. People understood floods, earthquakes, storms, fires, and disease as part of life, but explanations could include religious interpretations alongside practical observations. Omens and divine signs mattered. At the same time, Roman engineers understood drainage, construction, water management, and fire prevention. Ancient people did not necessarily divide the world into a simple opposition between science and superstition. Different explanations could coexist. Earthquake of 62 CE is a good example. Buildings were damaged, and the city underwent reconstruction. The earthquake may have been interpreted through religious ideas, but practical rebuilding required masonry, engineering, labor, and resources. Some structures remained incomplete for years. When the eruption came, archaeologists could identify unfinished work. A wall might lack its final decoration. A building might be under repair. A column could be standing without its completed capital. These unfinished details are valuable because they reveal a city in the middle of change. There was also political change in the wider Roman world. The eruption occurred only a few years after the civil wars that followed the death of Nero and the rise of the Flavian dynasty. Vespasian became emperor, followed by his son Titus. The eruption took place during Titus's reign. The disaster was therefore one event within a much larger historical period. While Pompeii's residents experienced the eruption as the defining event of their lives, the Roman Empire around them continued to operate. News traveled, officials responded, survivors moved, the empire absorbed the shock. The destruction of Pompeii was therefore not the end of Roman civilization. It was the end of one city. Nearby communities survived, and Rome itself continued for centuries. This distinction matters because archaeological sites can sometimes make history appear artificially frozen. Pompeii looks like a complete Roman world, but it was one part of a much larger civilization. The people who escaped the eruption continued living elsewhere. Their descendants became part of later Roman history. The buried city was silent, but the human story continued. Over the centuries, the buried city slowly became part of the landscape. Farmers cultivated the surrounding land. Explorers and treasure seekers occasionally encountered ancient remains. Tunnels were dug, objects were removed. Eventually, systematic excavation began to reveal entire streets and buildings. Each newly uncovered structure changed the understanding of Roman life. Archaeology became a gradual process of bringing the city back into view, although the phrase "bringing back" can be misleading. The ancient city could never truly return. Only its physical remains could be studied. The rediscovery also changed the way Europeans imagined antiquity. Pompeii became a major source of inspiration for artists, architects, writers, and scholars. Objects from the site influenced collections and museums. Its paintings affected artistic styles. Its architecture became a reference for neoclassical design. The city was transformed into a symbol of the ancient world. Yet the popularity of Pompeii sometimes created a tension between archaeological evidence and romantic imagination. Visitors wanted dramatic stories, while researchers needed to remain attentive to the quieter evidence. Modern Pompeii continues to challenge that balance. It is both a famous tourist destination and an active archaeological site. Millions of people can encounter the city, but every visitor contributes to the pressures of preservation. Foot traffic, humidity, sunlight, rain, and human contact all affect fragile structures. Conservation, therefore, involves difficult decisions. Not everything can remain open. Some buildings must be protected, restored, or closed. Archaeology is not simply about discovering the past. It is also about deciding how the past can survive into the future. Perhaps the most remarkable thing about Pompeii is how much of its ordinary world has survived. We can see the shape of a bakery. We can identify a public fountain. We can walk across the paving stones. We can see painted rooms. We can examine inscriptions. We can study carbonized food. We can trace wheel ruts. These things create a sense of closeness that is unusual in ancient history. The city does not merely tell us what Romans believed, it shows us where they lived. And yet there is a distance that can never be crossed. We cannot hear the original voices. We cannot smell the bread from the ovens. We cannot feel the heat of the Campanian sun on the walls. We cannot know exactly what each person thought when the mountain began to erupt. Archaeology gives us evidence, but not complete experience. That boundary should be respected. The mystery of Pompeii is not that we know nothing. It is that we know an extraordinary amount, while still remaining unable to recover the full human experience. The preserved city also reminds us that history can be accidental. The people of Pompeii did not intend to create a record for future generations. Their disaster created conditions that preserved parts of their world. Had the eruption not happened, many of the same objects would probably have decayed, been reused, broken, or thrown away. The archaeological record is often shaped by accidents. Fire, burial, flooding, abandonment, and other unusual events can preserve things that normally disappear. Pompeii is one of the clearest examples of this principle. A city is usually temporary. Buildings are repaired, replaced, demolished, or transformed. Streets change. Businesses close. Families move. New generations modify old spaces. Pompeii was no different. The eruption simply interrupted that process. Instead of gradually becoming another layer of history, the city became a sealed record. In a strange way, Vesuvius stopped time for parts of the town. Not perfectly, and not completely, but enough to give the modern world an unusually detailed glimpse of Roman urban life. As we move mentally through the quiet streets now, the most useful approach may be to avoid imagining the city as permanently dramatic. Most of Pompeii's days were probably uneventful. People woke, worked, ate, rested, traded, prayed, and slept. The city was full of repetition. That repetition is precisely what makes it historically valuable. A civilization is not made only from major events. It is built from thousands of ordinary routines repeated across generations. The bakery did not exist because history expected it to survive. The fountain was not built for archaeologists. The graffiti was not written for historians. The houses were not decorated for museums. The roads were not paved to become photographs. Each object belonged to its own moment. Their survival is what allows us to reconstruct that moment today. Pompeii therefore teaches us to pay attention to small things. A broken amphora can tell us about trade. A loaf of bread can tell us about food. A wall painting can tell us about taste. A pipe can tell us about infrastructure. A millstone can tell us about labor. A piece of graffiti can tell us about language. A skeleton can tell us about health and movement. A garden can tell us about wealth and environment. None of these pieces is the whole story. Together they form a mosaic. The word mosaic is especially appropriate because Pompeii itself was a mosaic of different lives. Wealthy households existed beside workshops. Public monuments stood near ordinary apartments. Temples stood beside shops. Political messages appeared beside personal graffiti. Luxury and poverty existed within the same city. Local traditions mixed with ideas from across the Mediterranean. Roman identity existed alongside older regional cultures. The city was not one thing. It was many things at once. When the eruption began, all of those differences became less important in one sense. The volcano did not care whether a person lived in a large house or a small room, yet the ability to escape could still depend on resources, location, health, mobility, and circumstance. Some people left early. Others waited. Some may have attempted to return for possessions. Others may have been unable to move. A disaster does not erase social differences completely. It reveals them in new ways. The human remains of Pompeii have therefore become an important subject of ethical archaeological study. Researchers must balance scientific investigation with respect for the dead. Modern techniques allow information to be extracted from remains without treating them simply as objects. DNA, isotopic analysis, dental evidence, and skeletal examination can provide information about diet, mobility, health, and ancestry. Each discovery can add to the historical picture, but the individuals remain people who lived lives rather than merely specimens from a disaster. The eruption also reminds us how quickly landscapes can change. A familiar mountain can become a source of destruction within hours. Streets can disappear beneath ash. Buildings can collapse. A coastline can change. The geological forces responsible for the eruption operate on timescales far longer than individual human lives, but occasionally those forces intersect with human history. Pompeii is one such intersection. It is both an archaeological site and a geological record. Scientists studying Vesuvius today can reconstruct aspects of ancient eruptions through layers of ash, pumice, lava, and chemical signatures. Modern volcanology has tools that the inhabitants of Pompeii could not have imagined. Instruments can monitor earthquakes, ground deformation, gas emissions, and other signals. Yet even with modern science, volcanic prediction remains difficult. The lesson from Pompeii is not that people should have known what was coming. It is that natural systems are complex, and human settlements exist within them. The city also gives us a different perspective on Roman engineering. The Romans are often remembered for roads, aqueducts, bridges, and monumental buildings, but Pompeii shows how these systems worked at the neighborhood level. Streets were graded for drainage. Water was distributed. Buildings were heated. Public spaces were maintained. Waste had to be managed. Construction materials had to be moved. Urban life depended on infrastructure that most residents probably took for granted. Even the Roman toilet and sewer systems can tell us something about urban organization. Pompeii's sanitation was not equivalent to a modern municipal system, and conditions varied greatly, but drains, latrines, cesspits, and water channels formed part of the city's infrastructure. Archaeologists can study these less glamorous features to understand diet, disease, waste disposal, and household organization. History often becomes more accurate when researchers are willing to examine ordinary and unpleasant subjects alongside temples and palaces. The same is true of clothing. Very little ordinary Roman clothing survives directly because textiles decay, but paintings, sculptures, metal fasteners, and preserved impressions provide clues. People wore tunics, cloaks, sandals, jewelry, and other garments according to their social circumstances and activities. Wealthier residents could possess finer fabrics and imported materials. Workers dressed practically. Children had their own clothing patterns. Clothing was functional, but it also communicated identity and status. The city was multilingual and culturally connected. Latin dominated official life, but other languages and traditions circulated through the Mediterranean. Greek culture remained influential throughout Roman society, particularly in art, education, philosophy, and religion. Pompeii's paintings and inscriptions reflect this broader cultural world. The Roman Empire was never culturally uniform. Its cities were connected by political institutions and trade networks, but local traditions continued to shape everyday life. The amphitheater offers another window into this cultural mixture. Gladiatorial combat is often remembered as a uniquely Roman spectacle, but the people who participated in and watched these events came from many backgrounds. Gladiators could be enslaved, condemned criminals, or volunteers who entered the profession for money and fame. Some became highly successful within the limited world available to them. Their names sometimes became known to spectators. The amphitheater was therefore a place where violence, celebrity, economics, and social status intersected. Pompeii's walls sometimes preserve the names of gladiators and political candidates. These inscriptions show that people could become recognizable public figures. The modern concept of celebrity is obviously different, but the ancient world also understood fame. A successful gladiator could attract supporters. A politician could cultivate a public image. A wealthy benefactor could sponsor buildings or games. Reputation mattered because Roman society depended heavily on personal relationships and public recognition. The city's public buildings also demonstrate the importance of generosity. Wealthy individuals could contribute to construction, festivals, games, or religious institutions. Such contributions could benefit the community while strengthening the donor's reputation. This system of patronage was central to Roman civic life. A public building might therefore carry more than architectural meaning. It could embody a relationship between wealth and social obligation. The homes of Pompeii reveal another aspect of Roman culture, the importance of hospitality. Dining rooms were carefully designed. Guests might recline on couches arranged around a central space. Meals could include several courses. Wine was served in different forms. Decorative paintings and mosaics created an environment suitable for display. Hosting guests was a social act. A meal could strengthen relationships, demonstrate wealth, and reinforce status. The dining room was therefore partly a stage. Not everyone participated equally in these displays. Many people lived more modest lives and worked long hours. The archaeological record is biased toward things that survive. Stone houses survive better than temporary shelters. Wealthy homes are more likely to contain elaborate decoration. Written inscriptions often come from people with access to writing materials or public spaces. Historians must therefore be cautious. Pompeii gives us an unusually broad record, but it still does not represent every resident equally. Children are another group whose lives can be difficult to reconstruct. Archaeologists have found toys, small objects, footprints, and evidence of children's presence in households. Yet ancient childhood remains partially hidden. Roman children learned through families, tutors, apprenticeships, and social experience. Wealthier boys might receive formal education, while others entered work early. Girls' lives were shaped by household expectations and social status. The city contained many childhoods, but only fragments survive. Pets and animals were part of this world as well. Dogs appear in mosaics and inscriptions, and animal remains provide evidence of livestock, food, and working animals. Donkeys and horses supported transportation and agriculture. Birds and other animals could be kept for food or companionship. A famous mosaic warning visitors to beware of the dog suggests that even ancient households used visual signs to communicate with visitors. Small details like these make the city feel unexpectedly familiar. At some point during the eruption, the ordinary rhythm of Pompeii ended. The exact sequence varied across neighborhoods, and the evidence does not allow us to reconstruct every individual moment. Ash fell, roofs weakened, visibility decreased, people moved through streets filled with debris, some sought shelter, others tried to escape. The volcanic environment changed rapidly. Eventually, the city disappeared beneath layers of material that would preserve it for nearly 2,000 years. And then, very slowly, another kind of history began, the history of Pompeii as an archaeological site. Excavators removed earth from streets that had once carried carts. They uncovered houses whose owners had been gone for centuries. They found objects where they had been left. They read inscriptions that had not been visible since antiquity. They entered rooms whose walls still carried paintings. Every excavation became a conversation between the present and the past. The longer Pompeii has been studied, the more its story has changed. Earlier generations sometimes focused on dramatic discoveries and famous objects. Later researchers became more interested in ordinary buildings, environmental evidence, social inequality, food, health, and infrastructure. The questions have expanded. Pompeii is no longer simply a frozen Roman city. It is a laboratory for understanding ancient urban life. This change in perspective is important. A history of Pompeii does not need to end with the eruption. In many ways, the eruption is only the event that created the archaeological record. The deeper story is the life that existed before it. The city mattered because people lived there. Its streets mattered because people walked them. Its shops mattered because people depended on them. Its houses mattered because families inhabited them. Its temples mattered because people believed in the gods they represented. If we imagine the city without the eruption, it becomes much easier to understand. The buildings would have aged. New owners would have renovated old houses. Streets would have been repaved. Shops would have changed hands. Political messages would have faded. Children would have grown into adults. Some residents would have moved away. New people would have arrived. Pompeii would have continued changing like every other city. The eruption interrupted that process and created the illusion of permanence. But there was nothing permanent about Pompeii when it was alive. It was constantly changing. That is perhaps one of the most important lessons archaeology can teach. Ancient cities were not static museum pieces. They were living environments. People repaired them, altered them, decorated them, neglected them, and rebuilt them. The ruins we see today are the final layer of a much longer process. As the evening settles over the modern archaeological site, the streets become quieter. The stone paving reflects the soft light. The walls remain in various states of preservation. Gardens have been replanted. Visitors leave. The ancient forum becomes still. Somewhere beneath the visible ruins are deeper layers belonging to earlier phases of the city. Somewhere beneath those layers are traces of people whose names were never recorded. The city is quiet now, but it is not empty of history. The mountain remains nearby. Vesuvius still dominates the landscape, just as it did in antiquity. The Bay of Naples continues to reflect the changing light. The same geological forces remain beneath the region, yet the modern landscape is different. Roads, towns, railways, farms, and cities surround the volcano. Human beings have built again in its shadow. Pompeii therefore remains both a warning and a historical record, reminding us that landscapes can be beautiful, productive, and dangerous at the same time. Perhaps the gentlest way to understand Pompeii is to think of it as a collection of interrupted moments. A loaf waiting to be eaten. A shop counter prepared for customers. A political message painted on a wall. A fountain serving water. A house being renovated. A garden growing quietly. A theater waiting for an audience. A road marked by wheels. A family preparing a meal. None of these moments expected to become immortal, yet together they have survived. And so, when we think about the lost city of Pompeii, we do not need to imagine only the final hours. We can imagine the many ordinary days that came before them. We can imagine the sound of sandals on stone, the movement of carts, the smell of bread from a bakery, the voices around a fountain, the quiet of a garden, and the warmth of the Mediterranean sun on painted walls. These are not details preserved perfectly. They are reconstructions built from evidence. But they help us remember that history belongs to ordinary people as much as it belongs to emperors. The city has been silent for nearly 2,000 years, yet it continues to speak through small things. A piece of pottery, a fragment of writing, a footprint, a wall painting, a pipe, a millstone, a garden seed, a loaf of bread. Each object is modest. Together they create something extraordinary, a glimpse of a vanished world. Tonight, we can leave Pompeii where it has remained for so long, beneath the quiet shadow of Vesuvius. The streets do not need to become crowded again. The shops do not need to open. The fountains do not need to flow. The ancient city can remain still, while the history around it continues to be studied and remembered. The people who lived there could never have imagined that their ordinary lives would become a window into the Roman world. Perhaps that is the quiet mystery of Pompeii. It was not preserved because its people wanted to be remembered. It was preserved because history sometimes creates records by accident. A city disappeared, and in disappearing it left behind an unusually detailed impression of itself. Thousands of years later, we can walk its streets and recognize something familiar in the lives of people who lived very far from us in time. The night grows quieter over the Bay of Naples. The volcanic mountain becomes a dark outline against the sky. The ancient walls of Pompeii rest beneath the stars. The stones have endured earthquakes, eruptions, centuries of burial, excavation, weather, and human curiosity. They have outlasted the people who built them, the empire that governed them, and many generations of those who came afterward. But the city does not need to be imagined as frozen forever. It can simply be remembered as it was, a living Roman town, filled with ordinary mornings and evenings, with work and rest, wealth and poverty, faith and entertainment, laughter and uncertainty. Its final day was extraordinary, but most of its history was not. Most of Pompeii was simply life. And perhaps that is enough for tonight. The streets can grow still. The last voices can fade. The warm light can leave the painted walls. Vesuvius can remain quietly above the bay. The ancient city can rest beneath the earth, while its story continues gently in our imagination. Thank you for spending this quiet hour in Pompeii. Let the streets of the ancient city become distant now, along with the forum, the fountains, the gardens, and the old stone roads. Let the sound of the Mediterranean become softer. Let the mountain fade into the darkness. The people of Pompeii lived ordinary lives in an extraordinary place, and their world has given us one of history's most remarkable glimpses into the past. For tonight, there is nothing more that needs to be uncovered. The city can remain quiet. May you rest peacefully, and may your night be calm.